From the 1960s onwards, many people within the churches began to re-evaluate both the broader history of the relations between the churches and Aboriginal peoples and the specific history of the residential schools. Many church organizations provided support to Aboriginal campaigns on such issues as land and treaty rights. In the 1980s, as seen here in the TRC report, the churches began to issue apologies to Aboriginal people. One of the first of these, issued in 1986 by the United Church of Canada, focused on the destructive impact that church missionary work had on Aboriginal culture. Of the several Roman Catholic apologies, including a number from bishops and groups of bishops, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission chose to include those of the Catholic religious orders that worked in the schools. In the report are the full text of the Oblate Apology of 1991, and again in 2014, offered by Father Ken Forster, the Provincial whom we will meet later in this film. On April 29, 2009, National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations Phil Fontaine, 4 other Aboriginal leaders, and 5 leaders from the Roman Catholic community in Canada traveled to Rome for a private audience with Pope Benedict XVI. The media reported that National Chief Fontaine and other Aboriginal leaders who had met with the Pope said that the meeting was significant for all survivors. Fontaine told CBC News that although it was not an official apology, he hoped that the Pope's statement of regret would bring closure to the issue for residential school survivors. The fact that the word apology was not used does not diminish this moment in any way, he said. This experience gives me great comfort. During the Commission's hearings, many survivors said that they knew that the Pope had traveled to Ireland and apologized to survivors of Catholic-run schools in that country. They wondered why no similar apology had been extended to them. As this film was brought to final production, Pope Francis, who is aware of the findings of the TRC and who has spoken passionately about the plight of Indigenous peoples around the world and pointed to Indigenous people as critical partners in a dialogue about climate change, has not yet come to Canada. When asked by the producers of this film in January 2019, Chief Fontaine said that he did not want to diminish the importance of the 2009 statement by Pope Benedict, but that it would also be a significant contribution to reconciliation for Pope Francis to come to Canada and make an official apology to the survivors of residential schools. "I am in favor of both," declared Chief Fontaine. On the same trip to Rome in 2009, Sister Marie Zeroni, one of the 5 leaders of the Roman Catholic community, who was part of the delegation, presented this statement on behalf of Roman Catholic women religious. Then again, in September 2013 in Vancouver, Sister Zeroni and 2 other congregational leaders made a very similar presentation to the TRC. Here is the full statement.
Territory of the Coast Salish, Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. We are presenting a statement on behalf of congregations of women religious involved in the Indian residential schools of Canada, first given in 2009. Canadian Catholic congregations of women religious provided hundreds of their members to teach and care for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children in Canada's Indian residential schools. We were products of the times in which we lived, with the teaching methods, cultural misunderstandings, social attitudes, and theology of those times.
We now know that the residential school system itself, initiated by the federal government and in which we participated, was racist and discriminatory. It brought about a form of cultural oppression and personal shame that has had a lasting effect not only on those who attended the schools, but also on subsequent generations. We carry immense sorrow for having contributed to this tragedy, a sorrow that stays within our hearts. We also now know that many children in our care suffered unspeakable abuse and mistreatment. Some sisters have been accused of actual abuse. Many others have been accused of not protecting those in their care. We are deeply grieved for the pain so many suffered. Our priorities in working towards the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement were that suffering be acknowledged, justice be done, and that we, as women religious, enter into a process of healing and reconciliation with you.
For 150 years, we have served as pastoral workers, teachers, nurses, social workers, and counselors on and off reserves, as well as in prisons, supporting those in Aboriginal leadership of various kinds and participating in community events. We commit ourselves to continue to walk with you and to continue in these activities as long as we can. Institutionally, we commit ourselves to use what influence we have to continue to support your efforts to achieve adequate housing, education, health care, social programs, and land rights. We also commit ourselves to enhance our efforts to foster awareness and understanding between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians, and to diminish persistent attitudes of racism and superiority. Each of our involvements with you has resulted in deep and lasting friendships between our sisters and many Aboriginal people. We treasure these friendships, and we look forward to deepening them in the years to come. Thank you.
The Jesuits in English Canada issued an apology delivered by Father Winston Rye in 2013. Apologies relating specifically to their roles in operating residential schools were offered by Primate Archbishop Michael Peers on behalf of the Anglican Church of Canada in 1993. The Presbyterian Church in Canada offered its apology in 1994, and in 1998, the United Church of Canada offered a second statement of apology delivered by the Right Reverend Bill Phipps.
Since the first United Church apology to First Nations people in 1986, in which we declared, "We tried to make you be like us, and in so doing, we helped destroy the vision that made you what you were." Since that statement, we have been on a painful, humbling, and intense journey of learning that we were wrong. The Indian residential school system was part of a wide, deep, and destructive project designed not only to assimilate, but to annihilate rich and ancient cultures of spirit, economy, governance, and love of our earthly home.
What they didn't understand, what they didn't see, was how embedded they were in a culture that believed in its own superiority and believed that anyone else was less than. So Indigenous people were less than settler peoples. They didn't recognize that they were living with the same cultural reality as every other settler person around them. And they just thought we were inferior to them, that they needed to change us to be like them.
Through the residential schools, sadly, we made efforts to crush expressions of Indigenous spirituality, as we made efforts to make their languages extinct. And what we're learning out of Truth and Reconciliation and a commitment to healing and reconciliation is that part of that is saying that was wrong. That was wrong. That was an assault on your dignity as being made in the image of God. That was an assault on your spirituality, your language, your culture. And as Michael Pearce said in the Apology of the Anglican Church of Canada, after he apologized for all the wrongs we committed in the schools, he kind of brought it all together by saying, I am sorry that we were part of a system that took you away from your homes, and a part of a system in which we tried to remake you in our image.
Well, the apology is to recognize that the Oblates of Mary Immaculate were a part of a system of really destruction of Aboriginal culture, language, spirituality. You know, we participated in a flawed system that separated children from their parents, that had deep implications even for generations to come. So it had a deep impact that way. It was personally very, it was very damaging to individuals who experienced either physical or sexual abuse within the context of the schools. And we're very aware of horrendous stories that have come out, and we as Oblates certainly have really feel a great shame for any of our members that were involved in such activity. We make apology to individuals who have suffered, but the whole culture have suffered. The whole of First Nations sense of belonging, and their being able to hold on to the traditions that have been important for them as a people, that has been destroyed in many ways.
The missionaries who ran the schools played prominent roles in the church-led campaigns to ban Aboriginal spiritual practices such as the potlatch and the sun dance, more properly called thirst dance. This hostility towards Aboriginal spiritual practice was a significant factor in the process of assimilation. Some First Nations people went underground practicing their traditional beliefs at home while attending Christian communal services in the village. Many Indigenous peoples who no longer subscribe to Christian teachings have found the reclaiming of their Indigenous spirituality important to their healing and sense of identity. Some have no desire to integrate Indigenous spirituality into Christian religious institutions. Rather, they believe that Indigenous spirituality and Western religion should coexist on separate but parallel paths. In contrast, Aboriginal Christians who also practice Indigenous spirituality seek Indigenous and Christian spiritual and religious coexistence within the churches themselves. There is still a degree of mistrust.
The other challenge that I see in the conversation about being Christian and Indigenous is that our ceremonial leaders in our communities mistrust the church. And I think there are many traditional ceremonial leaders on this land who would say that bringing Christianity into the lodge weakens our understanding of ourselves, is really not adequate, not sacred enough for the lodge. And that's the other side of the equation. So there are ceremonial leaders who would say, we don't want to talk about Christianity. We don't want it anywhere near the lodge, because of the history of oppression and condemnation that is brought upon us by the church, which is still active today, it's still happening today. So the conversation is difficult, but I think it's necessary. As a residential school survivor, I would say that the piece that is missing in the church is the perspective of Indigenous peoples about the holistic understanding of peoples in creation. That we belong to the land doesn't belong to us, that the land is good. And the weakness as Indigenous peoples that we understand is that we as humans have missed our original instructions. We don't understand what the Creator is calling us to be. So the work is not with a creation that is evil, that is to be discounted, as sometimes biblical interpretation is used. The whole idea of the fallen creation doesn't fit with our understanding. So I think there are major challenges. But I personally would say that I would tell my children and my grandchildren that it's possible to be Indigenous and Christian, and that for us is an important journey.
There's a lot of society that still negates Indigenous spirituality, but there are, particularly in the churches, there's more of awareness that Indigenous peoples do have spiritualities that are valid for them, and their way of coming to know their Creator, of honoring their Creator, and of guiding their lives. And so I know that within the Catholic Church, I've been for more than 30 years involved in the process of acknowledging Indigenous spirituality, reclaiming the practices of my own Indigenous culture, which I didn't have as a child, and recognizing that God works through every culture for the people of that culture. So I think that attitude is changing, but there are a lot of people in the pews that don't recognize that still are totally ignorant of Indigenous spirituality, totally unaware that there's another way of looking at life and meaning and purpose in life. They don't see that.
We have learned so much in our church about Indigenous spirituality. As I sometimes hear Indigenous people say to us, God didn't arrive when Columbus landed. We already had a very strong belief in God, a strong belief in the Creator, a strong belief in the sacredness of the land and the sacredness of people and their relationships with one another under the Creator's eye. We already had a sense that someone from God is the pain bearer of the world. And so what they have said to us is it wasn't hard for us to embrace the gospel, because the heart of the gospel has always been part of our spirituality.
I think that Indigenous teachings and practice are very compatible with a Christian faith and commitment. On the other hand, we have a lot of respect for those people, and I would say understanding and sympathy with those people who find Christianity as an institution hopelessly compromised by what has happened in the past. There are many Indigenous people who don't find that compromise fatal, but still are able to embrace both aspects of their spiritual traditions within a single identity.
Oh, Mother, I come to sit with you. Oh, Mother, I come to sit with you. Sit with you and receive your teachings.
The gospel is in fact about liberating the whole society so that judgment no longer declares that some people who are different are worth less than the others. And so it's possible, I think, to believe in our Indigenous teachings, in the Christian message, and not be in contradiction with each other, that there's a possibility of understanding life in a full way, holistically. And I believe that we as Indigenous have a perception of the gospel which is valid and significant.